I want to welcome everyone who is here this morning, to our guests, to regular attendees, to longtime members, to those who are with us on Zoom. We are, of course, I'm glad that you're all here, wherever you may be this morning. As we continue into 2024, it's the second Sunday of this new year. And as we are moving into this new year, I'm wondering if anyone here made a New Year's resolution. Anyone? Won't ask you if you did or how it's going, because perhaps that resolution has already been broken. You might be able to relate to the story of a young man. He was at a New Year's party and asked his friend for a cigarette. The friend replied, "I thought you made a New Year's resolution to quit smoking." The young man answered, "I'm in the process of quitting right now. I'm in the middle of phase 1. And he said, "What is phase 1? His friend asked. And the young man replied, he said, "I quit buying them." Personally, I'm not very big into New Year's resolutions. Although last year I made 6, and I kept them all in an envelope in the top drawer of my desk. I think I'm more into making jokes about New Year's resolutions than I am making them. But there is something to the idea of making a commitment, a resolution, a promise. There's something to the idea of reflecting on one's life as you begin a new year. There's something to looking at our lives that are in need of change or growth, or perhaps pursuing a new practice. It's good to examine our lives. I believe someone once said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, last Sunday, our response song was "This Little Light of Mine," and I had closed my sermon by stating that when we discover our calling, that we reflect God's glory and we let our light shine. And this past week, I was pondering how our little lights may shine. What qualities might a person cultivate to let God's life and God's light shine through them? And so I thought we'd begin a series of sermons for a few weeks that would identify some important qualities and spiritual practices that we can develop in our lives so that God's light can shine through us in this season of Epiphany, this season when we look for sacred surprises, during this season, the season of light. I bet most of us are familiar with that philosophical question, that age-old philosophical question, that if a tree falls in the woods and nobody is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Yes. Yes. Got one person who says yes. Because it's a philosophical question, because what it asks is whether something can exist without being perceived. Can we assume the unobserved world functions the same as the observed world? A similar question is raised by the story of 2 young fish swimming along. They happen to meet an older fish swimming in the other direction. And the older fish nods at them and he says to them, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And then the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What's water?" Do fish know they are in water? If they're submerged in water, do they know that they're wet? One person said fish are surrounded by water that it's impossible to see, and they can't see it until they get outside of it. Now, I think this idea of fish being in water is a perfect SAT analogy for humans in God's grace. Right? You remember the SAT that you took, right? Water, I think I did this right. Water is to fish as God's grace is to humans. We are surrounded by God's grace, whether we perceive it or not. We hear this in our scripture passage this morning from Psalm 139. The psalmist testifies to the grace of God, to God's grace, to God's inescapable presence. Let's listen to the good news found in Psalm 139. Oh, I forgot I had that slide up there about New Year's resolutions. All right, Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know me when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. And you hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and night wraps itself around me, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. And the psalmist continues, for it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I try to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me, those who speak of you maliciously and lift themselves up against you for evil. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and do not I loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Throughout these 24 verses, the psalmist declares his assurance and trust in God. First, in the first 6 verses, the psalmist proclaims that God knows his actions, his thoughts, and his words. He begins saying, you have searched me and known me. You know my actions. You know when I sit down, and when I rise up. You know my thoughts, even from far away. Even before I speak, you know the words that I will speak. The psalmist says, you hem me in behind and before. It's kind of like the prayer of St. Patrick, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ below me, Christ above me, right? God is with us. The psalmist is proclaiming that he is intimately known by God. Have you ever thought what it means to be known by another? Sometimes that can feel really, really good when we're known by another person, can't it? That sense of intimacy. You know, you probably have heard that phrase that intimacy is about, into me you see, right? Intimacy, into me you see. At the same time, being known in that way can raise a feeling of vulnerability. For example, if you confide in someone, you might be afraid that they don't keep your confidence. But the psalmist proclaims that to be known by God, when we're known by God, that is good news. It's a marvelous and mysterious reality that his or her life is accessible to God in every way and at every moment. So in response to God's knowledge of his actions and his thoughts and his words, the psalmist asks a question in verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? And then in the next verses, we hear the answer. The answer is nowhere. Right? God is present in the heavens, and he says God is present in the place of the dead, Sheol. God is present in the farthest limits of the sea. Even there, God will lead the psalmist. God's right hand will hold the psalmist fast. Even present in the darkness, the psalmist says, because even the darkness is not dark to God. It is as bright as day. This inescapable presence of God reminds me of Frances Thompson's poem, The Hound of Heaven. I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinth ways of my own mind, and in the midst of tears, I hid from him, and under running laughter, up vistaed hopes I sped. And later the poem says, by Thompson, he says, for though I knew his love who followed, yet was I sore adread, lest having him I must have not beside. JFX O'Connor, commenting on the poem, writes, as the hound follows the hare, never ceasing in its running, ever drawing nearer in the chase, with unhurrying and imperturbed pace, so does God follow the fleeing soul by his divine grace. And though in sin or in human love, away from God it seeks to hide itself, divine grace follows after. It follows ever after till the soul feels its pressure, forcing it to turn to him alone in that never-ending pursuit. The commentator's words reminds me of Psalm 23. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Goodness and mercy, God's goodness and mercy. God's grace pursues us. God's presence is inescapable. But just as water is to fish, so is God's grace to us. Are we aware of God's grace? After the psalmist affirms that God's presence and God's grace is all around him, the psalmist goes on that God's intimate knowledge of him is traced in God's creative activity, and speaks of him being born and being made, and wonderful are the works, and that I was not hidden from you, even when I was, being developed and born in the depths of my mother's womb, in the depths of the earth. Right? God was present even there. And it kind of says, how weighty to me are your thoughts, how vast the sum of them. And I try to count them. They are infinite. But I come to the end and you're still with me. And then we come to these verses in verse 19 to 22, and we experience a little discomfort, perhaps. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, God. It sounds like a request for personal revenge. But it's much broader and deeper than that. These words request that God sets things right in the world. And I think we all feel that from time to time, don't we? We all pray that, don't we? We open up the newspaper, or we turn on the television or the radio, and we think to ourselves, what bad news am I going to hear today? And there's a part of us that laments, and a part of us that just says, God, please set things right. In other words, it's kind of like praying, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, where you are, God. So, yes, the words request vengeance, but the matter is left in God's hands rather than taken into human hands. The psalmist is proclaiming, I'm on your side, God. And so having been searched, the psalmist asks God to continually search him. Having been known, the psalmist concludes that God would continually know him and that God would continually see him and that God would continually lead him. The psalmist entrusts his life to God now and forever, secure in the conviction that he or she has been known, is being, and will be fully known. The psalmist knows that God's activity will pursue us, will not let us go. That God's gracious love, God's grace found in God's inescapable presence invites both loyalty and sweet surrender when we come to realize the magnitude of God's grace and God's love. As the author in John says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." And so when I think of qualities of what it means to let our light shine, I come to God's grace and I ask these questions. Have we been by God's grace? It's not I cannot attain it. Or maybe you can place yourself that you have received God's grace in your life. Whether through the creation or through the gifts that you have been given in your life, or through having a relationship with God and walking with God, being open to God's grace and have received God's grace. Maybe you've professed God's grace through baptism. And you've shared that with others to say that you have entrusted your life, your present and your future life to God. Where can you place yourself on this gauge? Maybe after you've entrusted and presented in your life to God, you're able to practice hospitality and be gracious to others. I received grace this morning when I spoke to someone, and I told her I thought she was older than what she was. She practiced hospitality and grace and forgiveness, I think, as well. Well, I hope that's where she is. Can you pray, "Thy will be done," to really turn your life over to God's goodness and mercy? And can you share God's grace? As we progress, or as we place ourselves, the light shines through us. And we can each think of perhaps some practices or have conversations with one another about ways to grow in our experience of God's grace, so that our light would shine and that we would surrender all to God, that we would give him all our days and all our years and all our moments, that we would surrender all, that we would be grasped by God's grace, so that God's light may shine. If you have been unaware of God's grace and for some reason this morning you're feeling a large sense of God's grace being present with you and you would like to pray about that, I'll meet you at the foot of the stage here, the foot of the chancel. Maybe you want to recommit your life to God's grace. Maybe you have a particular prayer request that you would like to entrust to God this morning and you would like me to pray with you. Whatever it may be, whatever you are looking to surrender this morning, I invite you to come forward and speak with me if you wish. And I invite the rest of us to stand and sing, I surrender all.